The closet smelled like cedar wood and her mother's good perfume. Chioma pressed her back against the wall, knees pulled tight to her chest. The coats hanging above her head brushing her braids like quiet fingers. She had pulled the door almost shut, not all the way, because all the way felt like being buried. And now she sat in the thin stripe of yellow light that fell through the crack and tried very hard not to breathe too loud. Outside the closet, something fell and broke. Her mother cried out. Chioma squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her knuckles against her mouth. She had learned that trick from a cartoon once. If you push hard enough on your lips, the sounds that want to come out will stay in. She bit down on her own skin and tasted salt and thought about her mother's face that morning, humming over a pan of eggs, the radio playing something soft and old. She thought about that face now, so she wouldn't have to think about the sounds. There were two of them. Big men with loud boots who had knocked on the door the way people knock when knocking is already a threat. Her mother had told Chioma to go to her room. Chioma had gone further than that. She knew, the way children know things they are never directly told, that this was not a conversation for rooms with open doors. Another crash. Her mother's voice again, thin and pleading, a sound Chioma had never heard from her before, and it was worse than anything else. Worse than the breaking glass or the heavy footsteps, because her mother did not plead. Her mother negotiated. Her mother laughed things off. Her mother stood in the kitchen and said we'll be fine, baby girl with a certainty that Chioma had always believed without question. That voice was gone now. Chioma opened her eyes. The phone in her hand had 4% battery left. The screen was cracked from the time she dropped it running to catch the school bus. A thin white lightning bolt splitting the corner of the display. She had grabbed it from her mother's nightstand on her way to hide, some instinct, some animal understanding that she might need it. She opened her mother's contacts with shaking fingers. Most of the names she didn't recognize. Auntie Beezy, Dr. Famyide, the landlord, saved simply as do not answer. None of them felt right. None of them felt like enough. She didn't know what enough even looked like right now. She just knew it was not Auntie Beezy. Then she remembered the Bible. Her mother kept it on the shelf above the bed, old and thick, its black cover soft from years of handling. Chioma had looked through it once, not for scripture, but because she was curious, and she had found things tucked between the pages. A photograph, a dried flower, and on the inside back cover, written in her mother's careful handwriting, a short column of names and numbers. People her mother considered important enough to write down by hand. In ink, in a book she would never throw away. Chioma had not understood why any of those names mattered. She understood now that understanding was not the point. The point was the ink. The point was the Bible. The point was that her mother had written those numbers down because someday, one of them might be exactly enough. She crept out of the closet in a low crouch, moved across the dark bedroom on bare feet, and ran her finger down the column on the inside cover until she reached a name near the bottom. No title, no explanation, just a name and a number, written slightly darker than the others, like her mother had pressed harder on the pen. Petrov. Chioma didn't know who Petrov was. She dialed anyway. It rang twice. A man's voice came through the speaker, quiet, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't waste itself on unnecessary words. Who is this? Chioma's throat tightened. She pressed herself against the wall and listened to her mother cry out again from the other room, and something inside her chest hardened into something older than 7 years. Please, she whispered into the phone. They're beating my mama. A pause. Then address. Her battery hit 1%. She talked fast. The port was lit up like a small city. Floodlights ran along the entire length of the dock, turning the black water below into a mirror of cold white. 3 shipping containers sat open on the concrete. Their contents already inspected and approved by men who had been paid well enough to inspect and approve them without asking questions. 12 people stood around a folding table covered in documents, all of them waiting for the one signature that would close a deal worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Nikolai Petrov lowered his phone. He stood at the edge of the dock with his back to the table, looking out at the water, and said nothing for a long moment. The wind off the harbor moved through his dark suit jacket. He didn't adjust it. Behind him, his head of operations, a wide-shouldered man named Dex, cleared his throat carefully. Sir, the representatives from the Eastern Bloc have been waiting 40 minutes already. If we delay any further, cancel it. The words landed flat and final, like a door closing. Dex went very still. Sir? Reschedule. Nikolai turned from the water. His face gave nothing away. It never did, which was part of why people feared him. Anger was readable. Anger could be reasoned with, predicted, navigated around. Nikolai's stillness offered none of that. Tell them something came up. This deal is worth. I know what it's worth, Dex. He was already walking. I was the one who built it. The men around the table watched him pass with the careful, sideways attention of people who understood that staring directly was unwise. His personal bodyguard, a quiet man named Soren who communicated mostly through small movements and absolute loyalty, fell into step beside him without being asked. Nikolai pulled open the back door of the sedan himself. Dex followed, stopping just short of the car. His voice dropping low with the particular tension of a man trying to talk sense into a wall. Nikolai, whatever this is, send Soren. Send 2 teams. You don't need to be there personally. You're about to walk away from Dex. Nikolai looked at him over the roof of the car. Just looked. The way a man looks when the conversation is already over, and he is simply waiting for the other person to understand that. Go back to the table. Apologize for the delay. Offer them the Marchetti terms. Dex opened his mouth, closed it again, walked back toward the table. Nikolai got in. The door shut. The interior of the sedan was dark and quiet. All soft leather and controlled temperature, sealed away from the noise of the dock like a separate world entirely. He had spent years building that kind of quiet around himself. Controlled environments. Predictable variables. Situations where every outcome had already been calculated before he walked into the room. A 7-year-old girl with a dying phone had just dismantled all of that in under 30 seconds. He looked at the address he had typed into his phone. A neighborhood he recognized, not from business, but from a long time before business, from a version of himself he had buried so deep he sometimes forgot it had ever existed. He leaned forward. Victor. His driver's eyes appeared in the rearview mirror, steady and attentive. You know where Crestfield Road meets the old water tower? Yes. Sir. How long? 22 minutes. Maybe 18 if, burn the tires. Victor didn't ask why. That was one of the reasons Nikolai kept him. The sedan pulled away from the dock with a low, powerful surge, headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. Soren sat in the passenger seat, silent as always. After a moment he spoke, not turning around. Do you know the family? Nikolai didn't answer immediately. He was looking out the window at the city moving past, the bright parts and the dark parts, the wide, clean streets narrowing into older roads, the lights getting further apart. He thought about a name written in a Bible. He thought about a child's voice, already out of breath, already past tears, already down to the last hard thing she had left, which was the decision to call a stranger and ask him to be enough. I might, Nikolai said quietly. The sedan accelerated into the dark. Crestfield Road looked like a place that had once tried and then quietly given up. The streetlights were the first thing Nikolai noticed, or rather, the spaces where they should have been. 2 out of every 3 were dead, their poles standing like thin dark sentinels over cracked pavement and overgrown curbs. The ones still working flickered with the uncertain energy of things long overdue for replacement. Nobody had replaced them. Nobody had been sent to. That was how you could tell which parts of a city had been forgotten. Not by how loud they were, by how dark. Victor pulled the sedan to a slow stop half a block from the building, tucking it against the curb beneath one of the dead streetlights. No dramatic arrival. No screeching halt. Nikolai had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous men in any room were never the ones who announced themselves. He stepped out. The air here was different from the port, heavier, warmer, carrying the smell of fried food and old rain and something underneath, both that Nikolai recognized without being able to name. It was the smell of a place where people worked very hard and still came home to broken things. He knew that smell. He had grown up inside it. Soren came around the front of the car and stood beside him, and for a moment both men simply looked at the building. It was 3 stories of tired brick. The kind of structure that had probably been decent once, back when someone was still paying attention to it. A rusted fence ran along the front. Somebody had planted flowers along the inside of it, small yellow ones in a plastic pot, and the smallness of that effort, the stubborn cheerfulness of it against everything else, made something move briefly in Nikolai's chest. He put it away. Ground floor, end unit, he said quietly. The girl said the front door was already open. Soren nodded once. He had already scanned the building in the comm. Automatic way of a man whose eyes were essentially a security system. One exit at the rear. Fire escape on the east side, 3rd floor only. If they try to run, they go through the front. They won't run. Soren looked at him. They don't know what's coming, Nikolai said simply. They moved. There was a particular way Nikolai walked when he was working. Unhurried, completely upright, each step placed with quiet intention. It was not the walk of a man sneaking. It was the walk of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet and simply hadn't informed it yet. Soren matched his pace, slightly behind and to the right. The two of them crossing the cracked path to the front entrance in near silence. The door to the building hung open. The lock broken so long ago that the frame around it had grown used to the gap. A strip of yellow light fell out from inside and lay across the front step like something spilled. Nikolai stepped over it and went in. The hallway was long and narrow. Its ceiling low enough that the single bulb mounted at the far end barely pushed light all the way to the door. Paint peeled from the walls in slow curls. Somebody's bicycle was chained to the stair railing, its front wheel missing. A child's drawing was taped to one of the doors, a house with a big yellow sun above it. The kind of sun that only exists in pictures drawn by people who still believe mornings are unconditionally good. Nikolai's jaw tightened slightly. He did not slow down. From behind the last door on the left came sounds he had heard in many places over many years. The low, mean voices of men who were comfortable hurting someone. And underneath them, quieter and more devastating, the sounds of a person trying to hold themselves together while being broken apart. He stopped outside the door. Soren stopped beside him. They stood there in the dim hallway, and Nikolai listened. Not because he needed more information, but because he was giving himself exactly 3 seconds to shift from the man who closed port deals to the man he had been long before port deals existed. He straightened the collar of his jacket. 3 seconds passed. He looked at Soren. Soren looked at him. Nikolai lifted his foot and kicked the door open like it had personally offended him. The door had not been fully kicked open yet. That comes next. But in the space just before it, in the 3 seconds Nikolai had given himself, the hallway held its breath, and he stood inside that stillness and simply listened. The first voice was thick and bored, the way cruelty sounds when it has stopped needing to justify itself. You think crying changes numbers? You think I came here for tears? A pause. Something dragged across the floor. The amount doubled the moment we knocked. That's how interest works, sweetheart. Maybe you should have read the paper before you signed it. The second man laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, the kind of laugh that had nothing to do with anything being funny. More like a habit. A punctuation mark at the end of someone else's pain. Nikolai stood very still. He had heard voices like these before. He had grown up in buildings like this one, with walls thin enough that the whole floor knew each other's worst nights. He had heard men with voices like these through walls, through floors, through the particular silence of a child who has learned to make himself small and invisible and hopes that small and invisible is enough to be safe. It had not always been enough. His right hand moved to the front of his jacket and smoothed down the lapel. A small gesture. Almost nothing. Soren, who had been with him for 6 years, recognized it the way a person recognizes the moment a sky stops being overcast and starts being something more serious. Inside the room, the thick voice again, closer to the door now. You've got till the end of this visit to tell me where you're hiding the rest. After that, we stop being patient. Monica's voice came through the door like something torn. I don't have anything else. I told you already. Please, you told me a lot of things. None of them were useful. Another sound, heavy and deliberate. Monica cried out. Nikolai's hand stopped moving on his lapel. He looked at the door. It was hollow, cheap, the kind of door that existed to provide the idea of privacy rather than the reality of it. A small crack ran from the top hinge halfway down the frame. Through the gap beneath the door, a strip of harsh yellow light pulsed slightly as shadows moved inside the room. He noted the width of the hallway behind him, enough room. He noted the door's hinges, left side, which meant it opened inward to the right, which meant the first thing visible upon entry would be the near left corner of the room. He noted the sound of 2 distinct sets of footsteps inside, their weight distribution, their position relative to the door. He did all of this the way most people breathe. Without deciding to, Soren shifted his weight quietly and leaned a half-inch forward, which in Soren's language meant he was ready. The thick voice had started speaking again, something low and threatening about what came next if Monica didn't cooperate. The words layered with the casual confidence of someone who had never once been interrupted in the middle of this particular speech. Nikolai let him finish. Not out of courtesy. Out of something colder than that. The understanding that a man mid-sentence is a man whose hands are not yet doing anything else. A man still talking is a man who still believes the situation belongs to him. Nikolai believed in allowing people their last comfortable moment. He reached up one more time and adjusted the knot of his tie. Pressed 2 fingers along the silk until it sat perfectly centered, perfectly straight. The small precise action of a man who understood that how you enter a room is a message before a single word is spoken. The message he intended to send tonight was a simple one. It was the same message the Petrov name had delivered for 15 years in boardrooms, in back alleys, in harbors and warehouses, and every dark corner of this city where someone had made the mistake of believing they were the most dangerous thing present. The message was this: the room no longer belongs to you. He looked at Soren one last time. Soren gave a single nod. Nikolai lifted his foot. The door came off its upper hinge. It swung hard and fast and slammed into the inner wall with a sound like a gunshot, and for one frozen moment the entire room stopped. The 2 men, the overturned chair, the broken lamp on the floor, Monica on her knees with her arms raised over her head. Everything stopped. The way everything stops when something enters a space that does not belong to the world that space was operating in a second ago. Nikolai walked in. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for anything. He simply crossed the threshold and stood in the middle of the doorway with the dim hallway light behind him. And he looked at the room the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved and is now simply confirming. The first man, big leather jacket, a jaw like a concrete block, had spun around with his fist still raised, ready to direct his anger at whoever had interrupted him. He was the kind of man who had walked through a lot of doors in his life and understood that whoever kicks a door in is usually someone worth hitting first and questioning later. He looked at Nikolai. His fist stayed raised for exactly 2 seconds. Then it came down. Not in a swing. Just down. Slowly. The way a flag comes down at the end of something. The second man, thinner, wearing a gray tracksuit with a gold chain that caught the harsh overhead light, took 1 step backward without appearing to realize he was doing it. His eyes moved from Nikolai to the doorway behind him, where Soren now stood with his hands loose at his sides and his face carrying the expression of a man who found the entire situation mildly interesting. The room smelled like sweat and broken things. Monica was still on her knees beside the overturned coffee table, one hand pressed to the side of her face. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. She had looked up when the door came in, and now she stared at Nikolai with dark, wet eyes that held equal amounts of confusion and a fragile, disbelieving thing that was not quite hope yet, but was trying to become it. Nikolai looked at her for just a moment, long enough to confirm she was breathing, long enough to take a quick count of her injuries, and then he looked away. Not dismissively. With the focused calm of a man who has assigned her safety to a part of his mind that will not let go of it, and who now needs the rest of his attention for the 2 men currently recalculating their evening. The big man in the leather jacket found his voice first. "Who are you?" Nikolai said nothing. This too was a message. In Nikolai's experience, men who needed to announce themselves were men who were not entirely sure the room agreed with their importance. He had not needed to announce himself in a very long time. The man tried again, louder this time, armoring himself in volume the way people do when the ground beneath them has shifted and they haven't admitted it yet. "I said, who are you? This is private business, friend. You want to walk back out that door before this becomes your problem." Nikolai tilted his head very slightly to the left. "Petrov," Soren said from the doorway. Quietly, almost gently. Just the one word, offered into the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple was immediate. The thin man in the tracksuit made a sound that was not quite a word. His gold chain swung slightly as he stepped back again, his shoulders rising toward his ears. His whole body doing the involuntary mathematics of someone who has just understood exactly how badly they have miscalculated their evening. The big man's jaw tightened. But his eyes had changed. Something had gone out of them. That flat, bored confidence that had filled them a minute ago. That certainty that this room and everything in it belonged to him. It was gone now. In its place was something much more honest. Nikolai straightened his cufflink. He looked at the big man the way a man looks at something he is deciding the fate of, with no particular urgency, because the outcome is not in question. "Sit down," Nikolai said. It was the first thing he had said since entering the room. Both men sat. The two men sat. Soren moved into the room without being asked and positioned himself between them and the door. Not aggressively, just accurately, the way a lock positions itself in a frame. The thin man in the tracksuit kept his eyes on the floor. The big man in the leather jacket kept his on Nikolai, but the look had changed completely. It was watchful now, careful. The look of someone who has stopped making decisions and started waiting to be told what happens next. Nikolai let them wait. He turned to Monica. She was still on the floor beside the overturned coffee table, and she hadn't moved. Not because she was unable to, but because she seemed to be using every remaining piece of herself simply to stay upright and conscious. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. A cut above her brow had bled down the side of her face and dried there in a thin dark line. Her hands, pressed flat against the floor to hold herself up, were trembling very slightly. Nikolai crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. It was not something people who knew him would have expected. Nikolai Petrov did not crouch. He did not lower himself. In every room he had ever entered, the entire architecture of the space organized itself around the fact of his standing. But he went down on one knee in front of Monica Okizi on her broken floor without any hesitation, because some things were more important than architecture. He looked at her face. And then he went very still. It wasn't the injuries that stopped him. He had seen injuries. It was her eyes, even swollen, even wet with pain. They were a particular shade of deep brown that held a warmth in them that had nothing to do with the current situation. A warmth that seemed to exist as a permanent condition of the person behind them. Steady, patient, the kind of eyes that looked at a difficult world and somehow, stubbornly, kept seeing the good parts. He had seen those eyes before. Not on her. On a woman who had pressed a warm bowl of food into the hands of a 16-year-old boy bleeding from a knife wound behind a market on Vela Street, and had not asked him what he'd done to deserve the wound, and had not told him to leave, and had simply said, in a voice that carried that same steady warmth, "Eat first. Then we'll figure out the rest." That woman's name had been Grace Okizi. Nikolai stood up slowly. "What is your mother's name?" he said. It was not quite a question. His voice had shifted, still quiet, still controlled, but something underneath it had changed, like a current moving beneath the surface of very still water. Monica looked at him with her one open eye. Confused. Exhausted. "What? Your mother." He held her gaze. Her name. A breath. Grace. Grace Okizi. She passed 4 years ago. Why are you?" She stopped. Something in Nikolai's face had changed in a way that was very small and very significant. His jaw moved once. His eyes dropped briefly to the floor and then came back up, and when they did they were carrying something that had not been in them when he walked into the room. Not softness exactly. Something older and heavier than softness. Something that had been folded up and stored somewhere dark for a very long time and had just been handed back to him without warning. "She fed me," Nikolai said quietly. "Behind the Vela Street Market. I was 16. I had nothing. I was nobody." He paused. "She didn't ask questions. She just fed me and told me I had a face worth saving." Monica stared at him. "I never forgot that face," he said. "I forgot hers. But not that." He looked at her eyes again. Briefly. "Now I understand why." The room was completely silent. Even the two men on the floor seemed to have stopped existing for a moment. Reduced to furniture by the weight of what was moving through the air between Nikolai and the injured woman in front of him. Monica's face crumpled. Not from pain. From something much harder to carry than pain. Nikolai reached into his jacket pocket and produced a clean folded handkerchief. He held it out to her. "Your mother saved my life," he said. "I am here to return what I owe." Soren helped Monica to the couch. She moved carefully, one hand pressed to her ribs, and lowered herself onto the cushions with the slow, deliberate effort of someone navigating around pain they haven't fully measured yet. Nikolai watched until she was settled, then turned back to the room. The two men were still sitting where he had told them to sit. The thin one in the tracksuit had not looked up from the floor in several minutes. The big one in the leather jacket, Gregor. Nikolai had confirmed from the name Monica had whispered between shallow breaths, had been watching the exchange between Nikolai and Monica with a complicated expression. Not remorse. Men like Gregor did not carry remorse. It was something more practical than that. Recalculation. Nikolai pulled the one remaining upright chair from against the wall, turned it around, and sat on it backwards, his arms resting across the top of the backrest. It was a relaxed position, deliberately so. He looked at Gregor the way a man looks at paperwork he needs to get through before he can go home. "Talk," Nikolai said. Gregor shifted his weight. Up close he was larger than he had looked from the doorway, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had clearly spent considerable time being used as weapons. There was an old scar along his jawline and a newer one across his knuckles, and he wore them both with the quiet pride of a man who considered damage to his body a kind of resume. He cleared his throat. "This is a business matter," he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. The woman took a loan. 40,000. Signed papers. Agreed terms. The interest accrued because she missed 3 payments. "That's not cruelty, that's contract." "How much does she owe now?" Nikolai said. "With the accumulated interest and the late fees, the number." Gregor's jaw tightened slightly. 112,000. Nikolai nodded slowly. As though this was interesting information, he was filing away. "And the original lender? Who does he answer to?" "That's not information I'm able to." Gregor. Nikolai said the name the way you say the name of something you are about to pick up and examine. Calm. Focused. Completely without heat. "I am not asking because I don't know. I am asking to see whether you understand your own situation yet." A pause. "He answers to Voss," Gregor said. "Voss," Nikolai repeated. He nodded again. "Victor Voss, who runs his distribution through the Eastern Dock. The same Eastern Dock where, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, his primary shipping arrangement was cancelled." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you understand what that means for Victor Voss's operation over the next 30 days? Gregor said nothing, but something in his face shifted. "It means he has a significant problem," Nikolai continued, his voice carrying the same tone a teacher uses when walking a student through a sum they should have been able to solve on their own. "A problem large enough that a debt of 112,000 will feel very small and very unimportant to him very shortly. Which means the ledger you walked in here to collect on tonight," Nikolai paused, "no longer exists. You can't just, the business is finished." Gregor. Still no heat. Just the flat, clear delivery of a fact. Not damaged. Not disrupted. Finished. The loans, the collection operation, the arrangements with the lenders, the enforcement contracts, all of it. By tomorrow morning, every person Victor Voss employed to do what you are doing tonight in this neighborhood will be looking for a new source of income. Gregor stared at him. "You did all that for one woman?" Nikolai looked at him for a long moment. "I did it because it needed to be done," he said. "The woman is why I did it tonight." The thin man in the tracksuit made a quiet sound and put his face in his hands. Gregor sat very still, working through the mathematics of his new reality. His resume of scars and his reputation and his leather jacket and his years of operating in rooms where he was the most frightening presence. All of it had just become worth considerably less than it was an hour ago. Nikolai stood up and turned the chair back to face the wall. "The debt is cleared," he said. "All of it. Tonight." He straightened his jacket. "Now we discuss what happens to you." The closet door opened 3 inches. Nobody in the room noticed at first. Soren was standing near the window. Gregor and the thin man were being walked through the specific and unpleasant details of what their immediate future looked like, courtesy of 2 of Nikolai's men who had arrived quietly through the front entrance 4 minutes ago. Monica was on the couch with the handkerchief pressed to her brow, her eyes moving slowly around the room with the careful attention of someone still deciding whether the worst was actually over. Nikolai was the one who saw it. The closet was set into the wall at the far end of the short hallway that led to the bedroom, and the door had been pulled almost shut from the inside. Not all the way, because all the way felt like being buried. He had noticed it when he first entered the room and had made a quiet note of it, and had deliberately kept the most difficult parts of the evening positioned away from that end of the hallway. Now the door moved. 3 inches became 5. A small hand appeared around the edge of it, gripping the frame with the focused intensity of someone who has been still for a very long time and is now using every bit of their remaining courage to take one more step. Then a face appeared in the gap, one eye first, then both, scanning the room with quick, serious attention. Chioma. Her braids were half undone, the colored beads at the ends catching the light as she moved. Her blue dress was wrinkled from the floor of the closet. She had her mother's cracked phone held flat against her chest with both hands, The way you hold something you borrowed and are determined to return undamaged. Her eyes moved across the room in order of importance, first to her mother on the couch. And when she confirmed that her mother was upright and breathing and pressing a clean cloth to her face rather than lying on the floor, something in Chioma's small body released. Her shoulders came down. Her grip on the phone loosened slightly. Then she looked at Nikolai. He had not moved. He was standing near the center of the room in his dark suit, which up close was clearly expensive in a way that nothing else in this room was, and he was tall in the particular way of someone who does not need to make themselves taller. And his face was, well, his face was the kind of face that did not offer easy conclusions. Sharp and still, and carrying the residue of a very long evening. Chioma looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He did not smile. He did not crouch down or soften his expression into something designed to be less frightening to a child. Because he suspected, based on the 30-second phone call that had redirected his entire night, that this particular child would find that condescending. She had not called him in a panic. She had called him with a purpose. She had given him an address on 1% battery with the focused efficiency of someone who had already decided what needed to happen and was simply delegating the physical part. So he just looked at her, steadily, as one serious person looks at another. Chioma stepped out of the closet. She walked down the short hallway and into the room with the careful, upright posture of someone who has decided that whatever happens next, they will face it standing. She stopped a few feet from Nikolai and looked up at him, and the top of her head came to approximately the middle of his chest, which did not appear to concern her. She looked at his suit, at his watch, at the two men now being escorted toward the front door by people who had appeared without her fully understanding where they came from. She looked back at Nikolai. "You're the one I called," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Nikolai said. She considered this. "You came fast." "Yes." Another pause. She glanced at her mother, then back at him. Something moved through her face, a complicated, layered thing that was processing far more than most 7-year-olds were ever required to process. And then it settled into something quieter. She held out her mother's cracked phone toward him. "Thank you," Chioma said, "for picking up." Nikolai looked down at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than moments usually do. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for calling." Gregor left without a word. That was the most telling thing about him, in the end. He had walked into this home with the loud, heavy confidence of a man who believed that size and cruelty were the same thing as power. He walked out quietly, preceded by 2 of Nikolai's men and followed closely by the thin one in the tracksuit, and he did not look back at the room, or at Monica on the couch, or at the small girl standing in the middle of the floor watching him go. He looked at nothing. That was what happened when a man's power was taken from him completely and cleanly. Not broken, not challenged, simply removed. The way you remove a battery from something to stop it making noise. There was nothing left to look at anyone with. The front door closed behind them. The room was quiet for the first time all evening. Nikolai stood near the window and made 3 phone calls in succession, each one short, each one delivered in the same low, unhurried voice. The first arranged for a doctor. Not a hospital, because hospitals asked questions and Monica did not need questions tonight. She needed her ribs examined and her eye looked at, and someone calm and competent telling her what was damaged and what was not. The second call reached a man who handled certain legal and financial matters. And Nikolai told him to locate every document connected to the Okizi loan agreement and make them disappear before morning. The third call was to Victor, who was still sitting with the sedan outside, and it contained only an address and the instruction to go there and wait. He put the phone away. Soren was moving through the apartment with quiet efficiency, setting the overturned chair back on its feet, picking up the broken pieces of the lamp from the floor and placing them in a pile near the wall. He did it without being asked, without commenting on it, in the same matter-of-fact way he did everything. Nikolai watched him for a moment and felt the particular, wordless gratitude of a man who has spent years surrounded by people who understand that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply put the furniture back. Monica had not spoken since Gregor left. She was sitting on the couch with Chioma pressed against her side, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, her chin resting on top of the girl's head. Chioma had her arms around her mother's waist, and her eyes were closed, and she was not crying. She was just holding on with the concentrated, total commitment of someone who had spent several hours believing they might lose this exact thing, and was now making absolutely sure it was still there. Nikolai crossed the room and sat in the chair across from them. He did not speak immediately. He gave them the moment, because the moment belonged entirely to them, and he was only a visitor in it, regardless of how the evening had gone. Then Monica looked up at him. "She called you," she said softly. It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was a mother working out the full shape of what her daughter had done. "She did," Nikolai said. "Your mother's name was in your Bible." Chioma found the number next to it. Monica closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice stayed steady. "My mother always said that number was important. She never told me why. She saved my life," Nikolai said simply. "A long time ago, when I had nothing. I have spent 20 years becoming a man worth saving." He paused. "Tonight I had the chance to be worth it." Monica looked at him for a long moment with those steady, warm eyes that belonged to her mother's face, and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed to be said, and she seemed to understand that. Chioma opened her eyes and looked at Nikolai from the circle of her mother's arm. "Are you going to leave now?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "Will you come back?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a plain black card. No logo, no title. Just a number printed in small, clean type, and placed it on the table in front of her. "If you ever need me," he said, "use that number." Not the Bible. Chioma looked at the card. Then she looked at him with the same serious, clear-eyed expression she had worn since stepping out of the closet. "Okay," she said. "Like a contract. Like a promise exchanged between two people who both intend to keep it." Nikolai stood. He straightened his jacket, that same small, automatic gesture. And for the first time in as long as he could honestly remember, the weight of it felt different on his shoulders. For 10 years the black suit had been a uniform, a signal, a way of telling the world, before he opened his mouth, exactly what kind of man had entered the room and what that man was capable of. It still said all of those things. But standing in this small, battered living room with its yellow flowers by the fence, and its child's drawing somewhere down the hall, and its broken lamp in a pile by the wall, it felt like something else as well. Something he had not expected to feel again and had no immediate word for, except that it sat differently in his chest than power usually did. Warmer, steadier, like something that would still be there in the morning. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped and turned back one last time. Monica was watching him. Chioma was watching him. The room was quiet, and the lamp was broken, and the door was off one hinge, and everything was damaged in ways that would take time to repair. But they were whole. Nikolai nodded once, not as a boss, not as a man who had just resolved a transaction, but as one human being acknowledging another across a distance that the evening had, unexpectedly and permanently, made smaller. Then he walked out into the dark. Behind him, in the thin strip of light falling through the open door, Chioma picked up the black card from the table and held it carefully in both hands. She did not intend to need it, but she was very glad it existed.